It would certainly usher in an era of potentially direct democracy where the people of a province get to have an actual say on issues of public policy. And I think trains, police, and electricity are very, very topical issues that
the Democratic Alliance has introduced a private members' bill in the National Assembly calling for an amendment to the Referendums Act. What is the significance of this move by the DA? Well, in this extract from a longer conversation on my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara, I spoke with Richard Wilkinson, an attorney specialising in provincial law, to discuss the reasons for this move and what the DA is hoping to achieve. If you enjoyed this analysis, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel.
Right. This is really interesting. And this is something separate to what we've spent the last couple of minutes discussing. A provincial referendum, quite simply, or a national referendum is where every registered voter in the province would be invited to go to the polling stations on a particular date and vote on a particular question. So you're not voting for a political party. Instead, you're answering a question that is put to you, normally with a yes or no answer. And the last time South Africans went to the polls, although it was only white citizens who did this, was in 1992, when F.W. de Klerk called a national referendum, effectively asking people whether they approved of his reform process in which he was dismantling apartheid and moving towards a constitutional democracy. And I think 69% of people voted yes. So this is something that in the fully democratic era, South Africans have not had experience in. But the national constitution does provide for referendums to be called, firstly by the president on a national level. So President Ramaphosa has the constitutional authority to call a referendum on virtually any question. And that could be on any question. I mean, it could be, do you think we should legalize marijuana? That's a valid question. Do you think we should increase the voting age to 21? I mean, he could call it on any question he wants. But the national constitution and the provincial constitution also provide for the premier to call provincial referendums. And this is something that has not been tried before, and I think it's a long forgotten section of the constitution. But the premier is entitled to call referendums, but he must do so in accordance with national legislation. And that is the caveat that has sort of put the fly in the ointment here for the DA. The DA has expressed interest in the Western Cape being able to call provincial referendums. But there is no enabling legislation at the moment at a national level that would allow them to do so. So the Constitution says that the Premier may call a referendum in accordance with national legislation. The national legislation we have dates back to 1983. It's called the Referendums Act. And it allows the President to call a national referendum, but it makes no mention of provinces or the Premiers because it was passed in 1983, long before the new Constitution or before we entered into this three-tiered system of government.
Enjoying this analysis? Click here to sign up for our 30-day free trial for more content from the CIA.
So what the DA wants and what they are introducing in Parliament now is an amendment to the Referendums Act, which is going to empower the provinces or the premiers of the provinces to call referendums. And in an ideal world, as far as the DA is concerned, the National Parliament will enact this law. It will amend the Referendums Act, and Premier Alan Winde will then have the constitutional and the legislative authority to call his referendums, and they can then go ahead and call referendums. They're focusing on three areas: control over urban rail transport, control over the police, and control over electricity and energy production. So we haven't got full details on exactly what they intend to do, but it's very interesting because it would certainly usher in an era of potentially direct democracy where the people of a province get to have an actual say on issues of public policy. And I think trains, police, and electricity are very, very topical issues that are affecting everybody. It's affecting a broad spectrum of people. But it also raises interesting political issues as well. And we'd have to wait and see what the ANC's reaction is to this. I sense it probably won't be positive. The DA might end up having to go to the Constitutional Court to effectively force Parliament to pass legislation. We can't speculate too early. We have to wait and see what happens. And there's also a risk that the ANC and the EFF might decide to change the Constitution to take away this power altogether. But that's what lies in the future of the next couple of months.
And you mentioned policing, Richard, and in 2012, Premier Helen Zille initiated the Khayelitsha Commission of Inquiry into policing in Cape Town. And, after reports of police incompetence and, underfunding of Western Cape policing, that was then challenged by the SAPS. That went to the Constitutional Court, and eventually that was green-lighted. Former Justice O'Regan and Vusi Pukoli, the former Director of Public Prosecutions, were able to conduct their work. And the results of that inquiry were quite damning. And I think the lack of control and power that local representatives have over local police structures, I think, has resulted in huge issues with safety and security in the province.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is, again, a slightly different area of law. This has got to do with the Premier being able to call commissions of inquiry, which sits right next to the referendum provision in the Constitution. And that is what Helen Zille did in 2012. It's important to emphasize that the South African Police Service is managed centrally by the national government. There is no such thing as the Western Cape Police Service. It doesn't exist. The Western Cape's constitutional authority in respect of policing is limited to oversight. So they're entitled to monitor and engage with provincial police, with the provincial division of the South African Police Service. But I think the DA wants a bit more than that now. I think, judging by their press statement, what they would like is for control over the police to be transferred to the Western Cape government. Now, I obviously don't speak on behalf of the Western Cape government or the DA, so you'd need to ask them directly. But I think that's more or less the strategy they are proposing. And so I think what they'd want to do is call this provincial referendum. And one of the questions would be, do you support transferring control of policing and the SAPS from the national government to the provincial government? And then, provided the enabling legislation is passed, which is a big if, and there's a lot of politics that needs to happen before that law ever gets passed, the Premier would be authorized to call that referendum. The people of the Western Cape would go and vote, and they'd be faced with a yes or no question. Do you support transferring control of the SAPS to the provincial government? And it would be very interesting to see what that outcome is. If you assume that DA voters would support that, and I think that's a fair assumption to make, then my personal guess, and it's only a guess, is that you'd be looking at a positive result of over 60%, I would think, of the Western Cape's population probably voting in favor of that question. There is no legal impact. There's no binding legal effect of a referendum. It's important to stress that. When F.W. de Klerk called his referendum, it's really just advisory. But from a political perspective, these things take on a life of their own. And it becomes very difficult to defy the will of the people, especially if it is expressed with a resounding majority. If a large majority of people vote for trains and police and electricity to be transferred to the province, the national government can delay and they can ignore it. But the longer they delay undertaking that, I think they would lose credibility and they would be viewed as being authoritarian. And the ANC would find itself being in the unusual position of being on the wrong side of the masses, which is something that the ANC would not have experienced very often in its history.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this conversation, why don't you check out the full interview with Richard Wilkinson on my other channel? We've put a link in the description below, as well as here, where you can check out the full recording. My name is David Ansara. This is the Centre for Risk Analysis. Until next time, take care.